Am I audible? Hello, am I audible? Can you guys hear me?
Yes, Gigi, we can hear you.
Okay, great. I'm sorry, I'm just noticing the chat box. Sorry, guys. Quick one. Before we start today's session, my name is Jacob. Yes, my name is Jacob. That's my name actually, Jacob Johnson Attakpah. A lot of people call me JJ. I've come to be known by that name for quite some time now, and so that is it. I'm sure you've probably seen me at a tournament or seen me online or somewhere. If you haven't, this is the first time, and I hope it will be a nice interactive session. So today I'm going to be presenting on what it means to understand the climate crisis that people say we are facing now. Then we're going to talk about the Paris Climate Accord, and then we're going to talk about what the big guys think we should do about the climate crisis at the back of the Paris Climate Accord. And we're also going to take a detour, a couple of things, but largely this is what we're going to be talking about today. And so please, if you have any questions, I'd like you to write the questions down so that when I end the session, we can talk about the questions. And it's going to be like very quick. So we'll do that quickly, and then so that we can have a lot more on the discussions, because I'm sure that I don't have everything here on the slide. And so there are probably things that you guys know that I don't have in the slide. And so when you ask those questions, then I can always run back and then go and work on that. Great. So I think we should start the session now. Oh, come on. Great. So the things that we're going to talk about first, we're going to give context to what this thing is, the climate crisis is, and then we're going to look at some sort of perspective where we've come from, and then we're going to talk about two very big bodies, that is the IPCC and then the UNFCCC. Then we'll talk about the COPs, then we'll talk about COP21, and then the solutions. Then we'll look at the ideas that spurred on the solutions that were proposed. Then we'll also talk about the big polluters and then the deadlock that there is, or assuming there was no deadlock, what the situation is. Then we'll ask two questions. One, can we averse the crisis? Two, will we averse the crisis? And then we'll divert a bit and talk about some issues that are not so peripheral. Actually, many people think are central to the idea of climate change and the climate crisis, but some other people think otherwise. We'll talk about all those things and then we'll conclude the session and we'll have a discussion. So for context, right? So this is the basic thing. Climate change, when a lot of people say climate change, they're just referring to a change in the atmosphere or some change in weather conditions or not. But when you look at, so I'm trying to find a middle ground between science or the scientific definition and then what the average person thinks climate change is. And so that is it. Climate change is that change in average weather conditions over a period of 30 years or more. And so over 30 years, you can say that if you have data that's less than 30 years, you cannot say the climate has changed. But you have data that is over 30 years, and you see that there's a shift, a significant change. That is what the science people like to call it. There's a significant change in the average weather conditions over a phase. You can conclude that the climate has changed. And then the examples of the climate changing is when people tell you, oh, these days there's a lot more rainfall, or the seasons have changed. So in Africa here, we say there's a lot more rainfall or there's drought. When you go to the European countries, they will tell you that, oh, the permafrost is thawing and we're having a lot more pathogens getting exposed. When you go to the Americas, they will tell you, oh, previously Lake Michigan, they used to freeze, but these days it's freezing, there's a lot of ice skating and all those things. When you go to Oceania, they'll tell you, oh, our islands are sort of getting smaller in size, the landmass is getting smaller in size because are being swallowed up by the ocean. And so different people have different evidence that they ascribe to what we call climate change. So depending on where you are, your geographical location, the context within which you are in, whether you're a skeptic or you're a believer of climate change, there's a lot of evidence that will suggest whether or not the climate is indeed changing. And so there are two things that we need to note about the climate change. The first is that it can be natural. So naturally the climate changes. And so later on, when we're talking about skeptics, I'll tell you where that perspective is coming from and all that. But for now, let's just say that the climate changes naturally. And then there's also the anthropogenical side, which is human induced. So the things that you and I do that changes the climate. And so for the natural like shifts in climate, for example, the West African like climate, those of us in West Africa, our climate has some sort of inversion that happens over every 20 years. And so for every 20 years, taking data sets from 1980, for every 20 years, 1880, for every 20 years, there is some sort of inversion in our climate. And so the first set of 20 years was wet. The second set of 20 years was dry. The next set was wet. And so in that order. And so it could even possibly be that the rains that we're experiencing very rapidly, well, I can't say for the other places because I'm not following weather conditions over other parts of West Africa, but the changes in the weather patterns or the intensity of rainfall that we are seeing now in Ghana, for example, may not even be climate change. It may just be that we are in our inversion state, and so the weather is becoming very wet. And so we started our 20-year inversion state. It could be that. It could also be that it is not natural, and this is not our inversion state. We have actually done things that have made the climate respond to us in this regard. And so two things, it's either it's natural or it's not natural. And that means that human beings did something to the climate. And so these are some causes of climate change. So waste pollution or improper disposal of waste. We have deforestation, where you chop off trees and use them for firewood. There's breeding, especially of cattle, that produces a lot of methane that is responsible for trapping a lot of heat into our atmosphere. Then there's also industry. And so industry, we're talking of the manufacturing guys, we're talking of the coal plant, we're talking of the mining guys and all those places. And so all those things, as it were, come on to form what we like to call the climate change and all that. Hello, Tracy, I can see you. Do you want to see me? I guess not. Anyway, so let's go to the evidence. So like I said earlier, many times, right? Many times, there are different things that happen that show you whether or not, especially depending on where you are, whether or not the climate is indeed changing. And that's the responsibility there is that you, depending on where you are, you see it. So for example, if you're in a landlocked country, and then the only evidence that is presented to you that the climate is changing is sea level rise. Of course, you'd never know because you're in a landlocked country. And if the sea level is rising, you are not facing the effect directly. And so you most likely refute the idea that the climate is changing. And so coastal communities or small island states have this as evidence to show that the climate is rising. When you go to extreme weather conditions, places like the Sahara Desert, even places like United States, right, these days have severe extreme weather conditions. So in winter, Lake Michigan that didn't used to freeze is now freezing. When you go to Europe, they're having heat waves. So they're having heat waves where it gets very hot during summer. And so these are extreme weather conditions that people who exist within those geographical areas would say that the climate is changing. And then there's the increased precipitation, right? And so in the Ghanaian setting, for example, we've seen how like it's been raining very frequently these days, and so we can say that well, increased precipitation. So then there's climate change. Then there's the risk to nature, where we're having the mudslides, we're having a lot of other natural disasters that show that the climate is changing. And so some of the effects of said things are the flooding of communities along the coast. So for example, those of you who've been following the news in Ghana would realize that the Ghanaian coast, somewhere around the Volta region, has seen a lot of problems these past weeks. And so there's a drought and then the disturbing of agricultural processes that happens largely in Eastern Africa, for example. Then there's a crop damage and crop failure that has happened in the past. There's soil erosion, there's an increased risk of flooding that happened, I think some years ago. I think it was a year or two ago when Cape Coast flooded. We'll talk about that as well. And then there's the damage to the planet and then the things. So perspective, in 1949, right, there was a certain group called the UN Scientific Conference. And then they met and said that we need to protect our climate. We need to protect, well, not the climate specifically. They said we need to protect the environment because at the time, there was some sort of decoupling between the environment and the climate. And so the focus back then was on the environment. And so they met and then said that we need to speak about it, we need to talk about it, we need to raise awareness about it. And then in 1972, that was the first time climate change, that word was mentioned in diplomatic spaces. So, of course, scientists were talking about it in papers and all that, we were having conversations and all that. But the first time that conversation happened on a global stage was in 1972 at the UN Earth Summit. So what happened at that meeting was that there was some sort of consensus that the way in which we're industrializing, a lot of countries are industrializing, we're mining our resources, depleting the resources and the environment. There needed to be a conversation around that. And so fast forward, some 7 years after, the WMO, that's the World Meteorological Organization, together with some other body that we're going to talk about again later, said that we should have some sort of conference and talk about this specifically, because at the time, the World Meteorological Organization was trying to piece together the two pieces, that is the environment and then the climate. And so they are trying to put the two together because the science is now showing that you cannot decouple them, you cannot separate them, they do not exist in isolation, the two go hand in hand. And so what happens within the environment or within the natural or immediate environment of mankind has effect on the climate, which is not just present, but into the future as well. So the Vienna Convention in 1985 said that we should stop ozone layer depletion because now it was getting more and more serious. And so now the issues of global warming decided or began to creep into the conversation. And so first it was just about the environment and we are depleting natural resources. But now people were feeling hotter. And so the conversation of global warming started happening. And the science said that, well, it is the ozone layer, it is depleting, and so we need to do something about it. Then the United Nations Environmental Program again met in 1992 in Brazil. And then that was when the conversation was had finally. And then the UN Climate or UNFCCC or United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change happened. And so in 1992, when the parties met in May, the conversation was had, was agreed, and then later in June, it was open for signatories and for ratification by various parties. And then what happened, and today we have UN Climate and IPCC and all those people. So I said we're going to talk about two bodies, IPCC and UNFCCC. The first one is IPCC. So in somewhere 1988, we spoke about that earlier. The WMO and then UNEP decided to have IPCC. The point of the IPCC or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was supposed to be solely or is solely a scientific organization. So that is where you have the research into climate change. And so what they were supposed to do, because at the time, there were a lot of conversations happening about climate change, global warming, etc. There was, however, no consensus on what the science was. So a lot of scientists were having their independent research and all that without pointing to one issue and saying that we're having climate change, this is the problem. And so when IPCC was formed, they were mandated with coming up with the science, letting us know what the science is behind climate change, the evidence and all that. And so in the world over, IPCC is the body responsible for the science of climate change. And so the first time they sort of gave us a warning was in 1990, when they warned that if we do not stop polluting the atmosphere, what is going to happen is that in the next century or in the next 100 years, we're going to have global temperature spikes that are going to be between 1.5 degrees Celsius and 4.5 degrees Celsius. So usually before you get to any of these values, you have to do a lot of simulations. And so those simulations were done. And we see that if we go on business as usual, and that was in 1990, not the level of pollution that we have today, but based on the trajectory that we had from 1980 to 1990, and projecting that into the next 100 years, if we're going to go by that progression, between 1990 and 2090, we're going to have temperature spikes between 1.5 and 4.5 degrees Celsius. After that warning, the UN, the UNEP Environment Program again thought that, well, if this is the point, then we need to do something. If we have to do something, we need to make people aware. If we need to make people aware, we need to start making people take action. And in order to make people take action, we need to coagulate, as it were. And so let's bring everybody together. Let's have a serious conversation on climate change. And so in 1992, again, they went for a conference and then birthed the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. What now people refer to as UN Climate or UNFCCC or United Nations Climate, whichever one that you prefer. And so this was there to lead policy dialogue and replace the other organs that existed at the time that were responsible for leading policy with respect to climate change. The next thing is the cops. So the cops are not the police or the popo. The cops are the conference of parties. And so I think earlier I've mentioned that parties sat and parties negotiated, parties did this, parties did that. So the conference of parties are the various representations that have signed on to the Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC. So the conference of parties literally is just the group of people or the group of persons or representation of group of persons that have signed on to the idea that we need to do something about the climate change. And so the first time that the parties met was somewhere in 1995 officially. However, you realize that the UNFCCC was had in 1992. Was had in 1992, so that's when it was birthed. And at the birth, unofficially, that was the first one. That was the first one. And so at the time, the first one became COP1. And so moving forward, we are going to talk about the other COPs and all these things. And so that's in 1992, they did that. And then 1995, that was just 2 years later after that, they went to Japan, Kyoto, and then they had a Kyoto Protocol. What the Kyoto Protocol was supposed to do at the time was to reduce emissions. So, and then like protect the ozone layer. It's simple like that, protect ozone layer. And so because at the time, the conversations that were happening were, oh, we need to protect the ozone layer and the environment and all those things. The idea was, let's protect the ozone layer. Everything else will take care of itself. And so that is what the Conference of Parties is, basically. And so the parties are those who sign on. They are called parties and not countries or states because they are a lot of interest groups within there. And so if you go to the interest groups, we have the African groups of negotiators, we have the America, we have a lot of caucuses within the agreements, as we call it. And so all of them are parties. So even though, for example, Ghana is a party, there's another party called the African Group of Negotiators that Ghana is a part of. And so that is also a party. There are non-governmental agencies that are also parties to the agreement. And so you cannot say states or you cannot say countries or whatever. And so they call them parties. And so that is it with the COPs. But I think before we should go to like the major COPs and what they have brought out, I think let's take a detour. I'll try as much as possible to try and remember all of them. But let's take a quick detour to the COPs that have been had. And so 1992 was the unofficial first COP. And so in 95, there was a first COP officially. And then that when they went there, they said, oh, let's, as it were, focus on strengthening the UNFCCC. And then at COP2, which was the second COP, they endorsed what the IPCC was supposed to do. The second COP, yes, they endorsed what the IPCC was supposed to do. And then IPCC brought their second assessment report. And then that is when the IPCC, as it were, brought the second assessment report. And then they adopted that. Then COP3 came. And then there was quantitative limits on greenhouse gas emissions. And so at COP3, they said that greenhouse gases, especially by developed countries, or what we call Annex A countries, should reduce. And so that is when the argument was first made about this whole reduce the emissions and all those things. COP4, they said that in order to, as it were, implement the Kyoto Protocol, what they need to do was to give a buffer period for states that were supposed to implement the Kyoto Protocol to do that. And so 2-year ultimatum was given and said everybody who are supposed or who is supposed to, as it were, implement the Kyoto Protocol has a 2-year buffer time to be able to do that. The next COP was then one that says that, okay, if we do this, we need to transfer, as we are trying to reduce emissions by developed countries, let us help developing countries also reduce their emissions. This was proposed by the developed countries because they don't want to bear the responsibility alone. And so that conversation was had. Fast forward, a lot of COPs happened. So Marrakesh, Delhi, Buenos Aires, a lot. Montreal Protocol came in. So at Montreal Protocol, what happened was that at the COP in Montreal, I think that was the 11th one, major one. That was the 11th one. And so what happened was that we met after the Kyoto Protocol took force. So the Kyoto Protocol took force, and then they had an agreement that even aside mitigation, we should also look at aside reducing emissions and aside the ozone layer, we should also look at another part, which is how do we live with the problem that already is. And so we are trying to stop the problem from getting worse, but that admits that the problem is already here. So how then do we sort of try to live with the problem, right? How do we try to live with the problem? And that was the focus of the Montreal Protocol and all those things. And so fast forward, all the COPs happened. We had a lot of the COPs and all those things. But some major ones, like we've already spoken about the Kyoto Protocol. So the Kyoto Protocol happened, and then we said that let's reduce emissions. So sulfur hexafluoride, carbon dioxide, perfluorocarbons, methane, HFCs, like hydrofluorocarbons, and nitrous oxide were supposed to be reduced. So earlier, I told you about how breeding of livestock has an effect on the climate, and that is when methane comes in. And so especially ruminants like cattle, when they digest, they release methane. And so when they release methane, it traps heat into the atmosphere. It's not able to, as it were, move into outer space, so it traps heat into the atmosphere. And this is one reason why Argentina is one of the big polluters in the world, because they are known for breeding cattle a lot. And this same gas has also put Brazil on the map as well, because Brazil has the Amazon forest, and a lot of development is going on within the Amazon forest, such that within the Amazon forest, people are beginning to clear land to engage in farming of livestock as well. And so it's another gas that has put both Brazil and Argentina on the map. So in 2009, I already mentioned the Marrakesh, right? So there was a Marrakesh Accord that was sort of to shed light on what Kyoto Protocol was supposed to do and all that. And so in 2007, they negotiated on the Bali Action Plan. So the Bali Action Plan was essentially supposed to address between the Kyoto Protocol to the year 2000, right? To the year 2000, and between Kyoto Protocol and the year 2000, a lot of things happened. And then there was an extension on the limit of the Kyoto Protocol to 2015. And then that happened as well. So the Bali Action Plan was supposed to address the challenges that the Kyoto Protocol faced, so that when there is a new protocol, there cannot be, or there will not be the same challenges that happened. Then it birthed the Copenhagen Accord in 2009. So within this time, previously, there are what we call the least developed countries, or those are the poor countries, as we like to call them, right? And those are the poor countries. They were there. But we know that the world is, as it were, progressing. And so the economists guys will tell you that, oh, we're making more money. You don't know where the money is coming from, but yes, the money is coming. So everybody is making more money. We're becoming richer. If you're becoming richer, it means that previously least developed countries are now becoming developing countries. If you move out of the poverty zone into a developing country, it means that you have some amount of money on you. It means that the handouts that we're giving you cannot keep coming, because now you have some amount of money. You should sort of be semi-independent. And so the United States at the time, the developed countries, said that, well, we are developed and we are making good, well, not exactly good, but we are trying to fulfill the Kyoto Protocol. So what we need to do is that we need to co-opt developing countries like China, Brazil, India, South Africa, to be able to give some sort of commitment as well. So it's not just about developed countries doing things that are supposed to protect the climate. Developing countries should also do the same thing. The problem that you find with many agreements, and this particular agreement, is that there was no deadline. Even though they said that they should do it, these developing countries should do it, because now they are making money off pollution. They didn't give a deadline for what they should do. And so they just said, okay, go and then go and restore the climate. There was no deadline on when they should restore the climate. That's another problem with the climate negotiations and all that. And so another significant COP was the Cancun Argument in 2010. So it was significant to the point that the entire climate jurisdiction of the United Nations was somewhat hinged on it, because that is when a lot of the concrete things, right, the pointers that UN climate says that we should do in order to return the climate back to its place were formed. So previously, it was just go and do this, restore the climate. But in Cancun, in Mexico, what they did was that they said that we need to restore the climate, but there are certain things we need to do in restoring the climate. These are how we're going to measure those things, right? Fast forward 2011, at Durban, South Africa, they said that we need to do more. We need to do more such that they are, or now more parties are, as it were, climbing onto the idea of US that it's not only developed countries that should pay, but least developed countries should also pay as well. So they should also do what is okay for the climate to be restored. And so in Durban, South Africa, that happened. And so the Kyoto Protocol that sort of insulated developing countries from contributing to the solution was now taken away, or that insulation was now taken away. So now it co-opted developing countries to doing more as well. So COP21. So the 21st COP, or the 21st Conference of Parties, was the one that was held in Paris, the city of love, as people like to call it. So it was held in Paris, and that has now come to be what we call the Paris Agreement, or the Paris Climate Accord. So before the Paris Agreement, you realize that I mentioned the Montreal Protocol and the Kyoto Protocol and all these things. So back in the day, when we set out on this debate, then very early, the Paris Climate Accord was not there. So many times there was discussion on the Montreal Protocol and the Kyoto Protocol. One funny thing is that because I studied this in school, I got to know about it. But one funny thing is that I got to know about it in debates before I got to know about it in school proper. And so in discussions in class, when this was going on, I was just remembering all the time that we had used them in debate rooms without fully understanding the concepts that were behind it. And so that's one good thing about debates. You learn things that you may know later on in life, but by the time you get to know them later on in life, you already have a practical appreciation of what it is. So the Paris Climate Accord set out to do three things. The first is mitigation. And so mitigation is the idea that we need to do more to sequester carbon, or to store carbon, or to take away carbon from the atmosphere. That is it. So mitigation is anything that takes away carbon or greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. The reason why many times when we're talking about reducing emissions, we're talking about carbon and all those things, that even though methane and the HCFCs and all those ones are very dangerous gases, the one that abounds the most in the atmosphere is carbon dioxide especially. For those of you who read some sort of natural science or whatsoever, you know that carbon is naturally occurring in the environment. Carbon naturally occurs in the environment. Many people know that. So even if you didn't read natural science, you know that. But carbon dioxide is that has the most concentration of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So many times we're talking about sequestration, we're referring to carbon, taking out carbon from the atmosphere. So that's mitigation. Mitigation is any process that leads to the sequestration of carbon from the atmosphere. So in taking away carbon from the atmosphere, one of two things: either you stop polluting, which is stop emitting carbon dioxide, or you, as it were, take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So the one that you've already put in the atmosphere, you take it out of the atmosphere. So these are the two things that mitigation does. And so the first one on the slide, I said, initiate a global framework to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and pursuing efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees Celsius also above pre-industrial levels, with the hope that this would significantly reduce the risk and impact of climate change in their effort. And so that's the mitigation part of the Paris Accord. So the mitigation part is that we should take pollution back or limit. So in trying to limit global warming, we tackle it through pollution, but we should limit it to below 2 degrees Celsius above. So what it means is that if we had, say, if we're at 50% or 50 degrees Celsius, that's assuming that we're 50 degrees Celsius at pre-industrial level, by 2030, 2050, or whatever new year that we have set, we should be at 52 degrees Celsius by then. So we are trying to limit the global warming. And at limiting that, it means that at most, we can be at 2. So if we fail, we should be at 52 degrees Celsius. But if we succeed, we can come all the way down to 51.5 degrees Celsius, or even less than that, and that's fine. But should we fail on the Paris Accord, we should be only 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. That is a very Herculean task to find out whether we can do it, and if we can do it, whether we will do it. So the second thing on Paris Climate Accord is adaptation. So earlier we spoke about how the problem is already here. We're trying to solve the problem, but the problem is already here. And so we must be able to find ways of living with the problem. So the sea is already rising. Temperatures are already skyrocketing. Heat waves are happening. We're losing a lot of our vegetation. We're losing wildlife, etc., etc. We need to find ways to be able to live with the problem now. And so the second point was adaptation. Increase the ability to adapt to adverse effects of climate change and foster climate resilience and low greenhouse gas emissions development in a manner that does not threaten food production and other sources of livelihood. And so increase the ability to adapt. So, okay, so I give a definition for mitigation. So let me give a definition for adaptation. Adaptation is simply increasing the resilience or ability of a system to coexist with the problems of climate change or the effects of climate change. That's simple. So that's adaptation. So 3 things: 1, mitigation; 2, adaptation. The third one is the concept of to compensate for loss and damage. So that's the third thing that the Paris Climate Accord wanted to do: compensate for loss and damages. So in loss and damages, the idea, and this is not a very popular idea, because many times the loss and damage doesn't affect all of us. The mitigation and adaptation affects all of us. So we tend to forget about loss and damage. The point of loss and damage is that with loss and damage, the problem is here, right? We are trying to solve the problem. If the problem is here, we can only know that the problem is here because we are feeling the effects. And in feeling the effects, we've already spoke about how island states are losing their land, etc., etc. The point of loss and damage is that with the problem being here, we are losing certain things that we have, or we are damaging certain properties that we have, which are not necessarily economical or have economical value, which necessarily don't have economical value. And so land has an economic value. However, if you take away the economic dimension to land, it also has a cultural value. And so in losing your land, or in losing a shrine, or in losing a church, or in losing whatever, there's some sort of value that exists within that framework that is not necessarily an economic value. Hence, we need to compensate people for losing that. We need to compensate because they've lost something that they didn't intend on losing, or they've lost something through no fault of theirs that some other person has to do. And so things like the Green Climate Fund that my president was recently shouting about, that we are not getting the money, is supposed to compensate for such things, right? And so those are the 3 things that the Paris Accord set out to do: 1, mitigate; 2, adapt; and 3, compensate for loss and damage. So it says make finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. So Green Climate Fund is supposed to make available money so that we can compensate for loss and damages. So COP21 and the solutions. Let's talk about the solutions that COP21 brought. So COP21 solutions are these, a couple of them. 1, independent, nationally determined contributions. So COP21 said, or the Paris Accord says that, the Paris Accord says that INDCs are supposed to be done by countries And so if you've been following the conversation keenly, you'd realize that the Kyoto Protocol, Montreal Protocol, the Bali Accord, the Marrakesh Agreement, all those things were the UNFCCC telling countries that go and solve climate change. There were no pointers, there were no ways of measuring that change. It was just go and solve it. The command was coming from the UNFCCC by telling them that reduce emissions and all those things. What the Paris Climate Accord said would differ from the other accords and will now be the solution is that independent states or states should independently determine how they want to solve climate change. So Ecuador, for example, is supposed to go back from the COP. So we've ended COP. Go back to your country, go and sit down, dialogue, talk to your people. We have a problem that is facing the entire continent. Everybody has to solve their part of the problem. How do we as Ecuadorian people want to solve this problem? So you are supposed to, as it were, have your own solution to the climate change problem. For developing countries, what is good about it is there's some sort of financial incentive. So even though you as a country are supposed to say that, oh, this is the problem and I want to do this about it, the solution is going to be funded by the GCF, that's the Green Climate Fund, or UNFCCC is going to fund it. And so many people argue that it was going to fail, the INDCs was going to fail. I have a very radical perspective, but this is independent of today's discussion. I think the INDCs are the most useless thing in the Paris Accord, my personal perspective. It's the most useless thing in there. But people say it's going to work, so we're hoping against hope anyway. But hope is a fickle thing. So the INDCs are like this. You go say, I want to do this for the climate, I want to help prevent climate change. And then the GCF gives you money and says, go and do that. And so around the world, there are different projects that are the INDCs that many countries have done. The INDCs is for everybody to do. So every country, whether or not you are a signatory to the UN climate, you can have your INDC and it can be there. The minute you agree that you want to be a party to the Paris Climate Accord, and you're a party to the Paris Climate Accord, your plan moves from being an INDC to an NDC, which is a nationally determined contributions. What it means is that if once you become a party to the Paris Climate Accord, you are supposed to tell the UNFCCC what it is you want to do. Then they will guide you on how you can do it. So it is no more independent, but now it's a concerted effort. So even though the idea was hatched independently, now you are reporting to a UNFCCC because they are going to fund it. So if you're not a party to the Paris Climate Accord, what you have is an INDC. There's no money for you. But if you become a party to the accord, you become an NDC, your idea becomes an NDC. And then now it is funded by the GCF. If it's going to be funded by the GCF's executing body, which is the UNFCCC, needs to show you how you go about it. And you need to report back to the UNFCCC on how you did it, what were the markers that you used to determine whether it was successful, how has that contributed to averting the problem of climate change. So that is the difference between the INDCs and the NDCs. They're supposed to be the contribution that you do to the climate crisis, either mitigation or adaptation. Then, when you become a party to the Paris Accord, you move from being an INDC to now being an NDC. There's also the National Adaptation Program of Action, which is somewhat reserved, is it reserved? Yes, which is somewhat reserved for developing countries. And so what we now call the NAPA is the type of plan that is submitted again to the GCF's executing body, which is the UNFCCC, by LDCs. So LDCs are the least developed countries. And so least developed countries are the countries that do not have money. It means, one, they're not industrialized enough, so they may or may not have contributed to the climate change problem. So if they contributed to the climate change problem, you are not still a least developed country. But even if you did, the fact that you are a least developed country means that you have not contributed enough to the problem. That is why you are still least developed country. And so while the INDCs and the NDCs were reserved for emerging economies, developing countries, economies in transitions, the NAPA was reserved for least developed countries. So those are the countries that are abject poverty, as some people would like to say it. So what you do is that when you have your national adaptation program of action, you formulate the plan. When you formulate the plan, you submit to a UNFCCC, and then they'll help you work it out. Then there's a national adaptation plan, which is the process of executing the national adaptation program of action. So the NAP is sort of a sequel to the NAPA, if you would have it. So with the NAPA, what happens is that there is some kind of specific thing that you need to do in order to make sure that the NAPA works. So the NAPA is a process, usually a very strategic one, that will help countries to identify and address their medium and long-term priorities to adaptation. And so if you're a least developed country, what happens is that you don't have money, you've not spoiled the climate, but you also need to be able to stay with the problem because somebody else has done it. So you need to have a strategic roadmap that will enable you to identify, one, your medium-term priority in adaptation, and two, your long-term priority in adaptation. Adaptation comes in different forms. We'll talk about adaptation later on. So the NAP process, one, you're supposed to lay the groundwork and address the gaps. So what are the problems that you have? Second one is to prepare your elements. What do you need to prepare for the plan to take action? Then you go ahead with the implementation strategy, how you intend to implement it. And then finally, you report to a UNFCCC. The UNFCCC gives you the money. Then they monitor what you are doing. And then after the monitoring, there's a review of the process and see whether it is also, as it were, feasible or not feasible, whether it is competent enough to bring the adaptation that you claim that you are going to have. And so tech transfer is the next thing. So Paris Accord again says that there are countries that are rich. They have the mineral power, they have the economic power, they have all the things, the technological power to be able to effect the point of to avert the problem of climate crisis. However, these countries cannot do it alone. So what we need to do is we need to transfer some of that technology, or we need to let these developed countries teach the developing countries how to solve the climate problem in their own way. And so recently, again, when my president went for COP26 with an army of, I think, 31 people, what they were saying was that the money is not coming, the technology is not coming. How do you expect us to solve the climate problem and all that? And so those were one of his concerns as a president. Whether or not those concerns are real is a conversation for another day. So aside the tech transfer, there's also resilience building. And so resilience is the thing that would show whether or not you can withstand the problem of climate change, right? And so let me make a quick clarification here. In the climate change conversation or in sustainability conversations, there are two very tricky terms that are usually and many times conflated. There is the vulnerable states, and then there is the most affected people. So yes, sometimes it can mean the same thing, but in climate change conversation, it is not. It doesn't mean the same thing. The vulnerable persons to climate change are the people who are likely going to face the most problems. What it means is that there's no resilience. So the resilience of a system is just an ability, or the ability of a system to be able to come back to its former state after it has been exerted upon by an external force. And so the resilience of the environment to climate change is the ability of the environment to restore itself to a state before the effects of climate change happened. With this understanding of resilience, the most vulnerable states are the states that do not have resilience to climate change. Those are the vulnerable states. The most affected states are the states that are going to have the most effect, or are going to experience the most effect of the climate change. Like I said earlier, there are two terms that are many times conflated. They do not mean the same thing. Now you know they do not mean the same thing. However, you can be a vulnerable state and still be a most affected state, even though the two do not mean the same thing. And precisely that is why you can be one and the other, because they do not mean the same thing. So you can be a vulnerable state and not be a most affected state. You can be a most affected state and not be a vulnerable state. However, you can be a most affected state and still be a vulnerable state, or the other way around. You can be a vulnerable state and still be most affected. So that's the difference. So usually when we're talking about the vulnerable states, we're talking of states that are many times, the global south, the developing countries, the ones in sub-Saharan Africa, the ones in Southern America and the Caribbean, the ones in the Oceania, those places, they have low resilience towards climate change. However, many of them are not the most affected. The most affected many times are the Scandinavian countries, those around the Arctic, those of them that are close to the North Pole. They are the ones that are feeling the effects the most, because they are the ones having to bear the brunt, the immediate brunt of the melting ice caps, melting permafrost, heat waves, and all those things. So they are most affected. However, they have resilience. What does resilience look like? Resilience is usually having money to be able to solve the problem, or having technology to solve the problem. So for example, in America, there's food shortage in America. There's crop failure. There's no food. They don't have food. They don't have organic food, but they have money to be able to produce GMOs that can feed everybody. And so that system, even though it's most affected, it's not vulnerable because they have resilience. They have money to be able to produce GMO for everybody to eat. So they are vulnerable. Sorry, they are most affected, but they are not vulnerable. When you come to sub-Saharan Africa, a state like, say, let's talk about South Sudan, that has been plagued with conflict for some time now. Apologies to any South Sudanese here. But for such a state, if they are to have drought and crop failure, there's going to be famine. The World Health Organization is going to declare, or UNICEF is going to declare a humanitarian crisis, because one, they don't have organic food. The crops failed. But two, they don't even have money to produce GMOs. They don't have the technology to produce GMOs to feed the people in the absence of crop failure. And so, in that event, they are an affected country and they are vulnerable because the resilience is not there. Many times, you don't even need the effect to be able to test the vulnerability, because if a state is resilient, you would know by the factors that I've mentioned, the technology presence and the economic presence, or the economic power. The next thing that the COP wanted to do again, the COP21 Paris Accord wanted to do again, was to ensure transparency in reporting. So back then, we said go and change the climate. In changing the climate, you just go and change it. You don't come and tell us what you did, how you did it, and the markers that you used to measure if it was successful or not. You just go and then you come back and say, okay, I've changed the climate. And then we both sing hallelujah and everybody goes home. Doesn't happen under the Paris Climate Accord. What happens here is that you go, you say you do this. If you do it, you come back occasionally to us every 2 years and produce a report on what you are doing. Every 5 years, you are going to produce a progress report that says what you are doing, what you have achieved so far. So for every 2 years, you tell us what you are doing, the small gains that you are doing. Every 5 years, you tell us the big gains as well, what they have amounted to. And so there's transparency in reporting the issues, etc. And one last thing on loss and damages again is that many times for loss and damages, they are usually spurred on by slow onset events. So the reason why this came back to mind, again, like earlier, I said that I may not have everything on the slide, but most of it is all up in my head. And so as we go on, I'll just be chipping them in. And of course, you know most of them already. So when we get to the discussion part, you can ask me the questions. With transparency in reporting, there are things that you cannot be reporting every now and then. So for example, erosion. You will not see the erosion until you start feeling the effect of the erosion. Or you cannot see the rise in sea level until you start feeling the effect. So sea level was probably rising a long time. But until island states and coastal states realized that part of their land masses was being swallowed by the sea, they didn't realize that it was happening. So such an event is a slow onset event. So these are the things that lead to the compensation for loss and damage. So because those things are slow onset, we do not know what the problem is, and so we do not know the problem until the problem has arrived. We do not see the symptoms until it has arrived fully, and then we are supposed to, as it were, take responsibility for it. So slow onset events and having early warning systems, that's for the fast onset events, and then the non-economic losses and all those things happen to be some of the major things that the Paris Climate Accord proposed we do under that. So now let's go to the ideas behind the solutions that have been proposed. The first idea is what we call the PPP, right? The PPP is polluter pays principle, not private sector partnership. Polluter pays principle. The idea is that if you are polluting the environment, you should have to pay for it. It's that simple. If you are polluting the environment, you have to pay for it. And this is where my sort of economic expertise will also come into play about the economics of the PPP. It happens on various stages or various levels. So let me give you an example of how this works. If those of you who know F, if you follow his status recently, you may or may not have seen that he says that he is in a city or he's in Madrid and he was buying something from a shop, and then they asked him to buy his polythene bag. It's not just there. It happens in Tanzania as well, where when you go to one of the malls, of course I know the mall, but you buy your polythene bag, they don't give you polythene bag, you're supposed to buy it. In Ghana, the situation is different. In many other countries, the situation is different. But for the countries that have adopted the idea, it is that if you as an individual want to pollute the place, because there's no assurance, we are humans, there's no assurance that you are going to properly dispose of that said polythene bag that you are going to have. There's no assurance. The only way you can assure us that it will be done is if you pay for it. So if you pay for it, you are giving the state money in order to collect them, recycle them, or dispose of them properly. And so that's the only assurance that the state can have. Your word does not mean anything to the state. Pay. Your money is what means something to the state, right? And so that is it. Polluter pays principle. If you are willing to pollute the system, you must be willing to pay. The idea was experimented firstly around the petroleum guys. And so we said that the petroleum people are polluting the atmosphere. They are drilling oil and polluting the atmosphere. So they need to pay. Then the petroleum guy said that, no. We are not mining, we are not drilling oil and we're not drilling all those other petroleum products because we are happy doing it. Well, we want the money anyway. But we're only doing it because you people have cars. Your machines and your cars and your engines are going to be running on what we are drilling. If you don't drill it, you guys cannot move your cars and your machines again. So you're not doing it because you're happy. We're helping you guys. And so you guys are supposed to pay. And then there was some sort of consensus that, well, we're all going to do something. Those who are drilling the oil should do something about the problem. Those who are using it should also do something about the problem. And so it was experimental on that front. And then that is where we are today with respect to the PPP. Oh, I'm sorry. Grace says she can't hear me. Please, can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, JJ.
Okay, so I think Grace has a problem and she should fix that. Okay. So Grace, please alert us when you fix the problem. Should we wait for Grace or we can go ahead without Grace? Well, the slides are here, so I'm sure she can follow from the slide. Moving on swiftly. So PPP, polluter pays principle. Well, I'm only now realizing that my slides are not as detailed as they should be. So even if she's following from the slides, she may not follow properly. But I mean, the idea is that PPP, she's had a part of it, so she'll be good. In any case, those of you listening, you can always volunteer the information to her after that. The second idea behind, so the PPP, the polluter pays principle, is so for every idea, I want to make this part of the session interactive so that some of you don't see. So the first idea is PPP. From the solutions that we've spoken about, which solution is hinged on the idea of the polluter pays principle? I want somebody to tell us that. So feel free to raise your hand or you can just type your response in the chat section and then we can all read along. So which solution is backed by the polluter pays principle? Goodness gracious, are you guys asleep? Or nobody knows the response? Which is it? Hello, can you guys hear me? Please, if you can hear me, unmute yourself and say something. I need to know I haven't wasted close to 30 minutes or so. Oh, actually close to an hour.
I can hear you, but I didn't get the question that you're desiring a response to.
Oh, okay. So my question is that currently we're talking about the ideas behind the solutions that were proposed by the Paris Accord. We're speaking about the polluter pays principle, which says that the person who is responsible for polluting the environment should pay for cleaning up the environment. So I'm asking, which of the solutions that have we spoken about earlier is hinged on this idea? Goodness. There are 15 people. Is that to say that the 50 people cannot hear me or they don't know the response? I'm tempted to think that you guys are asleep, not because you don't know the response. Okay, so this is what we're going to do. We're going to call out people.
Hello?
Yes, hello. Grace,
okay,
you want to respond?
Can I? Yes.
Go ahead, please.
It should be the second one, that's the nationals determined contributions. That's for people who signed the Paris Club Accord, and they are developed countries that are causing the climate change of itself. So they are paying for it, and I guess they are used as compensations for other countries who are victims of the aftermath of their industrialization and their means of causing climate change. I hope you could hear me. I'm still in my class.
Yes, I can hear you. Great. Awesome response. So that is it. So PPP is hinged on that one in particular and a couple of others. But let's take that one in isolation because she spoke about the NDCs and the INDCs. So the INDCs are the ones that says that go and tell us how you want to solve the problem, and then we'll give you money to solve the problem. So the Green Climate Fund, which was established under the Paris Accord, which is where the rich countries are supposed to pay $100 million annually to help other countries solve the climate problem, is one that is hinged on the polluter pays principle, because the idea is that the Annex A countries, the rich guys, France, Britain, Germany, US, and the likes, have I mentioned Britain already? Yes, those guys, they have actively benefited of this problem or benefited of industrialization that has brought this problem. If that is the point, they should be able to pay for repairing it. Great response. So let's go to the next one, equity and distributive justice. The idea is this. I mean, we know what equity is. Distributive justice, we know what justice is, we know what distributive is. So that should explain itself, right? But let's dig a bit deep into it. So the idea of equity and distributive justice is we both didn't contribute equal proportions to the problem, and so we must not contribute equal solutions to the problem. And so some countries will be responsible for both mitigation and adaptation, as well as paying into the Green Climate Fund. Some countries will only be doing the NDCs, which is proposing solutions for the NDCs, proposing solutions for the climate crisis, and then they will be paid for it. Some countries, which are the LDCs, are only going to do the NAPA because they have not benefited of the problem, or they didn't contribute to the problem. They are not benefiting of the problem, and so they just have to concentrate on how to adapt. They don't need to pay any money for anybody to solve the problem. They also don't need to take active measures to stop the problem. They just need to adapt to the problem. So that is the idea of equity and distributive justice. The idea is we all didn't contribute to the problem together. We cannot pay the same price together. We need to pay it in proportions of how we contributed. Later on in this discussion, we're going to find out how this idea has been a major setback for climate action. Usually, climate action is the counter to the climate crisis. So the solution to climate change is climate action, as people like to call it. So the next one is intergenerational justice. The idea of intergenerational justice is, I just remember the funny thing that happened a couple of weeks ago. Intergenerational justice. Quick one. Is Kojo here?
No, Kojo is not here. But this
Kojo
shade
is
you
not
want.
here. Okay, if Kojo were here, I'd have asked him to narrate what happened. But since he's not here, we'll not narrate it. We'll save all of us the stress of going there. So intergenerational justice says that there are different generations across. All of them must be treated fairly and equally. Or I cannot use fairly now because Andrew says that he has a problem with fair. So all of them, all generations must be treated in a just manner, if that is clear enough. So we must all be treated in a just manner. So the solution is for those of us here now to treat the environment in a way such that those of us who will come later would benefit of the things that we came to meet. So we have vegetation, we have the ocean, we have fishes, we have wildlife, we have all those things. We have to treat those things in a very nice way, such that those who come after us will also come and see them. So it is rather unfortunate that these days we don't see mammoth. We don't see great mammoth. But back in the day, there used to be great mammoth. We could have had the option of seeing them. The environment didn't keep them for us. We have the African giant elephant, which is somewhat an endangered species now. So what intergenerational justice says that we have to treat the African giant elephant in such a way that we have had the pleasure of seeing them. We are getting tourism benefit out of them. Let us protect them such that 50 years from now, the generations that will come would not only be looking at the African giant elephant from documentaries and textbooks and storybooks, but will have the opportunity to see them with their eyes as well. So we're doing right by future generations by ensuring that the way we were unable to see the great mammoths that existed before us, we're giving them the chance to be able to see the African giant elephant that is after us. One question many people ask is, if we were rid of the opportunity to be able to see the mammoth, why should we then give some other people the opportunity to see elephants and all that? That is a conversation that we'll have when we come to the other side of the discussion. So sovereignty and autonomy, an idea that backs them is that backs the solution is that everybody has a chance to determine what they want to do. And so independence, everybody is an independent state, right? All the parties are independent. They are not dependent on anybody. So the idea is that if you are dependent, you have autonomy, you're a sovereign state. If you're a sovereign, also shout out to Karim on this one. If you're a sovereign state, you must determine what you want to do, and then we can help you do it. So we will not determine what you should do, but you go ahead, say what you want to do, we'll help you do it. Then we come to environmental justice. We need to do right by the environment because this is a symbiotic relationship. So as persons or as individuals, we need to do right by the environment because we benefit of the environment benefits of us. And so we need to do that. Another thing is economic rationality. The idea is that to take, and this is one interesting thing by one of my professors. So my professor, he teaches in Accra, and he has a farm, he has farms. He has both cashew and cocoa farms in Tichima. And then he drives a Highlander. He has not just one car, he has several cars. So he drives a Highlander to class. And then there was this time we saw him in a pickup. And we asked him, Prof, but we're all trying to solve the climate change problem. Why is it that you have a Highlander 4x4 and then you have another 4x4 in a pickup? He said, oh, because I go to Techiman to visit my farm on the weekends, I should be able to drive comfortably. And then we asked, but we are trying to solve the climate problem. You can drive in a Picanto and then go to Techiman. And he says that no, he can do that, but he will not do that. We need to solve the climate crisis, but you must do that rationally. Don't go and kill yourself because you want to solve the climate problem. If we're all trying to solve the climate problem and we die, what happens to the environment? It's a waste of effort. And so in trying to solve the climate change problem, do not go and die. Stay alive and solve the climate change problem. And so you have to solve the climate problem based on economic rationality. Do not do things that will hurt your economy at the expense of the environment. Later on, we'll talk about the triple bottom line approach to solving things, and then you get more context on what economic rationality is. And so, but just the tip of that iceberg, the reason why many states opposed the Kyoto Protocol when the idea was first proposed was because the argument was that it's true, we need to solve the climate crisis, but it will harm our economies. And so many people like to say this in debates that the American economy is run on coal. And so if they adopt the climate change approach to things, it means that the economy will crash. It is not entirely true that the economy will crash. It's not also entirely true that the American economy runs on coal. But it is true. If they decide to do away with coal and go green, there's a problem that will happen with the economy. We'll analyze that. Sorry, you guys will analyze that in an economic class, not in a climate change class. So we'll move on then. Oops, what's happening? So environmental racism, which is an offshoot of the environmental justice thing that we have, right? So a lot of wasteful sites are in low-income communities of color, and this is within the context of the US. And so in the US, a lot of waste landfill sites are in low-income communities of color. Another fact is that Black households that earn between 50K and 60K per year live in neighborhoods that are more polluted than white households that earn below 10K per year. Black people are 3 out of 4 times more likely to live near fence line zones. And like fence line zones are places that are close to chemical facilities and all those things. So Black people are 3 out of 4 times more likely to live near fence line zones than the average population. And finally, 68% of Black people live within 30 miles of a coal-fired power plant, while only 56% of Caucasian people live within the same 30 miles of a coal-fired power plant. This is in the US perspective. But let's bring it to a perspective that you and I can relate. So I don't know the various countries that are represented here, but I try to have examples that can cut across everybody so that we can all I mean, from the names alone, I know that Ghana is represented here. I know that Nigeria as well is represented here. I don't know if any other countries are represented here, but I'll try and add Kenya to the mix so that the examples would now make sense to everybody. Not make sense per se, but I mean, relatable. So when you come to Ghana, those of you who know the Pong landfill site, you see where Pong landfill site is located? Yes, it's located there because it could not have been located in Accra proper or Tema proper because the rich folks live there. And so they push it to the periphery of the town because land within Tema proper is expensive or land within Accra proper is expensive. They push the landfill site to Pong. That land is not expensive. And so the relatively poorer persons are the ones who buy land there. And so as for them, they do not have economic power, one, which most likely means that they do not have social capital, which also most likely means that their political capital is very weak. And so there's nothing they can do but live with the rubbish that is there. That is an example for the Ghanaian set, or the Ghanaian context. When you go to Nigeria, the Makoko slum, you realize how dirty that place is. The slum that is on that river. You realize how dirty that place is. And there is a lot of pollution going on there without anybody taking any sort of reservation to it. Why? Because the same reasons I gave you for why in Ghana, the Pong landfill site is closer to that side. The same reason why same thing is happening in Nigeria, in the Makoko slum. Because people there do not have social capital, they have political capital, and they do not have economic capital as well. So what is happening in the Makoko slum with the indiscriminate dumping of refuse, even to the extent that the state even does it, is that when you go to main island, you cannot do those things there. The people there have economic capital, they have political capital, which translates to social capital. And so you cannot go and do all the nonsense that you're doing in Makoko on the island. When you move to somewhere Nigeria, Kenya, in the Kibera slums, it's the same thing. The same reasons cut across. And so the people there are impoverished. They do not have either social or even both social and political capital. So there's nothing that they can do about the situation. And that is it. Environmental racism, treating the environment close to economically disadvantaged people poorer because they do not have the capacity and the ability to react to that. So that is the idea of environmental racism. The next thing that we'll talk about is the big polluters and the deadlock. Or maybe not. Maybe there's no deadlock. So let's talk about the big polluters. So this data is from 2019. I'm sorry, this is not an academic session. So I think I didn't reference the document. I should learn to do better. I'm sorry, guys, but this was picked off the internet. I've forgotten when it was picked off on the internet. And it's accurate data. I didn't pick it from Google. I picked it from a correct source. And so that is the distribution of carbon dioxide that some of the big polluters have. So that's the distribution. So China, US, India, Russia, those people. That is one what people have. And so even now, and many people say this, or many people within the climate space say this, that the reason why China is becoming more economically viable is because they are polluting more. They are polluting more. And so they are becoming more economically viable. And as of last week, I read that they've now overtaken the United States as the richest country on our planet. And so, yeah, there you have evidence of the pollution by the big polluters. So this is some sort of infographic or some graph that shows what we spoke about previously. And so you can see that these are all the other countries. The other countries are doing this. So they realize that China is doing this. They are getting money. So let's also do the same thing. United States, they are doing that. They're also doing that, but you see that they are all the way because of their policies as well. So because Biden and how do you call them? Those guys, Bush. So the GOP, should I say this? Yeah, I think I'll see it. So the GOP is usually attributed to or associated with people who do not believe in climate change. So what we'll talk about the skeptics later, but the GOP, the Republican Party, they don't believe in climate change. Democrats do. And so if you look at the graph, I think it shows some sort of likeliness to that. So around the year 2000, some sort of dip happened. Some sort of increase happened, and then dipped, and then it went up again, and it kept going up, and then so that was a period of the GOP. So Bush, the Cheney side, and then I think somewhere here should be Obama, Democrats, and so there's some sort of dip there as well, and then it goes ahead to dip and dip and dip, and then go. And so that is it. So that shows the trajectory. And then there's also the I just got notification that
you're breaking a lot.
My internet connection is not stable. Am I audible, please?
Most of the classes had left, so everybody is tired. But this is an important thing, and you know that. Go and sit down first.
Hello guys. So I'm sure JJ would rejoin the call very soon. So let's just stay put and he'll be back. Yeah, he is.
Hello? Hello?
Yeah, hello JJ. You're audible now.
Oh, sorry. Guys, I'm very, very sorry. So let me go back very speed. Oh goodness, why is it back unstable? Hi, so may we go ahead? Okay, great. So I think I can go ahead. So let's move on. So I was showing the infographic of how the progression of the emissions happened. And so you can see that international shipping and aviation, those of you who travel to tournaments a lot, you guys are somewhere here. So you've been traveling to tournaments a lot, so you're contributing this much. Then there's Japan. Japan is somewhere here that are also industrializing, but are looking more into tech and green, a lot of greens actually. And then there's Russia. Russia is also a big polluter, but they're somewhere around here. But I mean, the big people are China and US. The EU are doing well, so you can see that there's a dip in their thing and all that. So yeah, move on. So climate change, like the conversation has moved to being a very complex environmental issue and a political one as well. And in most often than not, many spaces, an economic one as well. One that is not confined to any national boundary. And so if we are supposed to have a conversation around how to solve it, because the climate change problem is borderless, the solution must also be borderless, or the proponents or the contributors to that solution must also be borderless. So in climate negotiations, the success or otherwise of these treaties are dependent on three major things. One, distributive justice. We've already spoken about that. Two, reciprocity. And three, economic rationality. So these are the three things that would show if it's going to be successful or not. One, distributive justice. Is everybody okay with what they are getting? Is it a fair? I said fair again. Andrew, I'm sorry, but I think we cannot go away with that way. Is it a fair thing to all the parties involved? Second one is reciprocity. Are we doing good by the people that are suffering from the problem, and are the people who have benefited of the problem doing good by the people who are facing the problem now? Reciprocity, economic rationality. It has to be reasonable. You cannot stop your economy because you want to solve climate change. It cannot work. Triple bottom line approach will teach you that. And so these are the three problems. The major setback with a lot of international treaties is that many times one of these three problems has always brought the treaty to a standstill. So all parties must agree on all three. If even one party or a subsection of the party or a how do you call them, a caucus, feels that one of the pillars or one of the ideas, distributive justice, reciprocity, and economic rationality, is not reasonable enough, then Yamutu means that negotiations have to stall. And so that is it. So the difficulty in reaching international agreements usually, is because of the cost-benefit analysis and then action results trade-off of the treaties that exist. So these are the things that are there like that. And so the Kyoto Protocol, for instance, failed due to parties contesting emission reduction targets and a timetable for achieving these targets, and also appropriate strategies to adopt in realizing these targets. So the Kyoto Protocol failed because people thought it was not just enough, so distributive justice was not there. And so that's why Kyoto Protocol failed. Another thing is that the Just Cons, which is Japan, US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, thought of that the organization and of course the OECD, the European countries, that economic reasons are the reasons why they cannot stop polluting. So economic rationality. Economic reasons are the reasons why they cannot stop polluting. Even if they wanted to, they cannot, because their economies will take a hit. It will not come to a standstill, but it will take a hit. And so this is it. So it's up to you to decide whether or not you have a deadlock based on all the information that you have and what we are going to do next. So equity also becomes highly contested issue that drags back the protocol, because least developed countries at the time, also note that these countries are not now LDCs. At the time of the Kyoto Protocol, they were LDCs, Brazil, China, and India. They were exempted from emission targets, and according to the US, was a distributive injustice, because about 80% of the world's population is found in the least developed countries, and their emission contributions are significant. This is the problem that I have with economists and mathematicians. They like to double round percentage and numbers. So 2 instances, 80% of 100 is 80, right? 80% of 100 is 80. 100% of 50 is 50. Based on these 2 preambles, economists can make the situation so murky that you think that, so if depending on what side of the arguments they want to have, they are going to tell you that 80%, so instead of using the numbers which are 50 and 100, in order to show you the severity of the problem, they are going to tell you that, oh, one scenario is 80%, the other is 100%. So you'll be alarmed by the 100% scenario because that is total. Forgetting that the 100% of that total is just a little above even 50% of the 80%. I don't know if I'm confusing you like the economists usually do, but I think you get the idea. The idea is that many times they like to play around the numbers and percentages to confuse us. So 80% of 100 is 80. However, 100% of 50 is 50. So even though 50 is less than 80, when you look at it on a percentage front, 50 is more than 100 because 100% of 50 is 50 and 80% of 100 is 80. And so the US argument at the time was that 80% of the world's population is found in LDCs. That is true. 80% of the world's population is found in LDCs. Their contributions are significant. But look at the numbers, and if you are to distribute emissions across each of these people that the US says are in the LDCs, let us compare emission per capita to the emission per capita of the US and see what the difference is. So even though 80% of the world's population are in LDCs and they are contributing, 20% of emissions are coming from the Annex A countries and economies in transition. If that is the case, if we do an emission per capita calculation, those of developing countries or least developing countries are way, 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 way less, and I dare say insignificant as compared to that from the US. And so percentage was a very tricky way of making a condition now. But I think now everybody has cleared their eyes, and so the percentages numbers game is not going to be anything that's going to confuse anybody again. Then another thing was that there's a strategy for achieving a target was another challenge. How do we go about it? Does everybody go and solve their problem, or we have to come and take the solution from the UNFCCC? Some people said, let's have carbon sinks. So carbon sinks are how we sequester carbon. So trees are a form of carbon sink. We also have artificial carbon sinks. So there are places where we store carbon. So Shell has experimented around that idea for a very long time. And they have some carbon sinks in Southern America. So they have carbon sinks that are artificial carbon sinks. So they extract CO2 from the atmosphere and trap it underground so that it doesn't contribute to the climate change problem, right? And so those are some things. And then there was also the idea that for it to happen, everybody must have some sort of cap. So emissions trading, that is where emissions trading happens. So everybody has some sort of level of emission that they are supposed to emit. So if you do not emit all of it, then you can then sell to another country that is not emitting, and then they can emit on your behalf and get money out of it. So there's another idea that has been doubled around and all those things. But one thing you need to note is that the US is a very strong country. People like to say that China is strong, but a lot of the climate negotiations that happen and have stalled are because the US says it should stall, and hence it must stall. In effect, it has stalled. So many of these treaties are hinged on the participation of US. Also because US has a lot of soft power, so they can whip a lot of other countries in line. We're not supporting this idea, so nobody has to support it, and that is it. Or we're supporting this idea, everybody has to support it, and that is it. And so that is one reason why many of it has failed. And so it's now up to you to decide whether or not you are at the deadlock or not. So now we're at the point of the not so periphery ideas. Sustainable development. So the idea or the sustainable development was birthed by the Brundtland Commission. Forgotten the year, but the Brundtland Commission. So Gro Harlem Brundtland, one of the world's elders. You are debaters. I'm sure many of you know about the group called the Elders. Mandela was part of it. Some other notable persons were part of it or are part of it. The Elders. She's a member of the Elders, and she is sort of my look-up person when it comes to sustainability issues. So she was a former Norwegian prime minister who was tasked with the idea of coming up with this whole idea of sustainable development. So it was her commission that is the Brundtland Commission that is created with the idea of the definition of sustainable development. So this is a very complex definition, but let's go through it all together. Sustainable development is an organized principle for meeting human development goals while simultaneously sustaining the ability of natural systems and future generations to provide the natural resources and ecosystem services on which the economy and society depend on, such that said future generations are not deprived of those resources. So we have resources now. Let us use them to the point that the natural system does not get destroyed, so that the future generations can also have access to those natural systems and the natural resources. That's the idea of sustainable development. I'm sure many of you have studied it because sustainability science is one science that is interconnected to every field. And so everything is sustainable these days with the sustainable development goals. So even finance is sustainable, eating is sustainable. And so a lot of things happen that have to be sustainable. Building, living, drinking, all those things sustainable. So measuring development, a triple bottom line approach. So TBL says that back in the day, development was, in some states, it was measured with happiness. Some places, most places, it was measured with l'argent, with money. How much money the state has will determine whether the state is developed or not. TBL says that it's not just about that. We need to look at three things to be able to measure development holistically. The first one is the economics, of course, the money, traditional way of measuring development. The second one is society. Are people happy with the so-called development that they have? The next one is the environment. And we're developed all right, but do you have marshes that can be able to filter water for you guys, filter spring water for you guys? You have forests that can be able to provide you with some sort of ecosystem services. We have a lot of other things, right? So these these things, the triple bottom line approach, are the three pillars that many people like to use to measure development now. And I'm saying this is under the not so peripheral idea because it is central to the idea of climate action. It is not a periphery, it is not an adjunct, it is central to the idea. Many people like to push it away. I don't like to. And so it is a framework that has three parts: social, environmental, and financial. So the framework is now used to evaluate development from a broader perspective to create greater developmental value. So in measuring development, we like to do triple bottom approach, even in finance. So for those of you who have some sort of banking background, many times when you're going to a bank for a loan for a project, they will ask you to produce the reports. They'll ask you to produce the reports. For many international organizations that like to fund the projects in developing countries, they will ask those countries to produce an EIA report, environmental impact assessment report, that shows that the project does not have adverse effects on the environment. And so an immediate one that I can think of is, those of you who have been to Ghana before, those of you who are in Ghana, the stretch of the road that leads from Malam Junction and enter the Accra Mall, the George Walker Bush Highway, that road, when it was about to be constructed, there were some hawkers around the Achimota overhead side of the place. And so the hawkers there were supposed to be sacked. If the hawkers were going to be sacked, they was going to take money out of their pockets and all those things. So the financiers of the project told the government at the time that if you do not find alternative livelihood for the hawkers, the project is not going to go on. And these are not hawkers on the entire stretch of the road. These are hawkers just around the Achimota overhead side, the Achimota overhead side of the road, close to Jolu Junction, that side. Those hawkers, you have to find alternative livelihood for them. If you don't, the project is not going to go on. And so the government at the time had to find it for them before the project went on. And that's how serious it can get sometimes. I attempted to talk about ISO certification, but that will go into the technicalities, so we'll not do that. So triple bottom line approach: costs, society, environment. It's like that. So green tech. Another conspiracy with green tech is that it is expensive. Green tech is not expensive if you look at it from the perspective of the triple bottom line approach. Green tech is not expensive. So in your debates, don't shout, "Oh, green tech is expensive," or don't go and say, "Oh, green tech is not expensive," and leave it at that. You need to show why, one, it is expensive, or two, it is not expensive. So things like solar power, wind power, hydropower, geothermal energy, biomass, biofuel, electric cars, etc., are green tech. They are concepts of green technology. That is the development and application of products, equipment, and systems that is used to conserve the environment, which minimizes the negative impacts from human activities. The technology can be in the form of green buildings or renewable energy, such as hydro, solar, biogas. Also, this is for those of you who are rich and want to undertake building. If you want to, I run a firm, an environmental firm, right? So if you want to do green building, and by green building, I don't just mean solar power. Green building is like from the purchasing of the land to when you inhabit the land. Sorry, then you inhabit the structure. That's green building. If you want to do green building, I have a firm that does that, so you can see me after this session, or you can take my contacts from Andrew, or you can ask in the chat section and I'll drop it. Renewable energy, hydro, solar, biogas. Another misconception with solar is not cheap. Solar is expensive. It's expensive because of the technology that it comes from, which has been cheapened now. But not only that, it's expensive because it's a product. It has a life cycle. At the end of the cycle of the solar powered batteries, there is no technology that disposes of it safe. And so Japan invested heavily. When I say heavily, I mean heavily in solar power. The panels have come. The panels have come to the end of their life cycle analysis. Japan has a lot of non-usable solar tech now. They don't know how to dispose of it, and so it is there. So it's true. Africa, we have a lot of sun. It doesn't mean everybody should go and put up solar panel. You can put it up when it stops working, or when it spoils, or when the life cycle ends. How will you dispose of it? That's a problem that we need to think about. So those of you who are scientists here, who are researchers here, you can go ahead and do some research into that. I'm more into the policy side of things, so I don't concern myself with these kind of things. When it comes to the thinking through that, I only do the implementation and policy analysis. So challenges with green tech. So dealing with the diffusion, right? Dealing and diffusing environmental risk, how large the scope is and extreme intensity of the problem. So there's an energy crisis. We have been told that we need to go into renewable energy and all that, but we need to know that the problem is wide. Poor people cannot access renewable energy, but they need energy as well. They are also deserving, they are equally deserving, I dare say, of energy as much as the rich person is. And so the problem is big, the scope is huge, the problem is intense. We need to deal with it. And dealing with it is problematic because of the scope of the problem and how we have to deal with it. Second thing is about achieving radical, sustainable technological change in a very short period. How do you do this? So, like I said, okay, like I will say, so let me just say it now. We can solve, no, I won't say it now. Let me keep that for later. So we can decide to stop flying. We can say, hey, nobody should fly again. Let's stop emissions. Let's shut down all the factories and everything. Let's stop emitting. And one day, the whole world can stop emitting. 2 days, 1 month, it can stop emitting. But is it an economic rational decision? That's the problem. There are radical environmental justice radical environmental justice campaigners like the ever popular Greta Thunberg, who I disagree with in principle, by the way, about her methods. But yes, there are those people, and then how we need to be very radical in it. And that's the problem. I think that we must never come to a point of radicalism anywhere and everywhere. We must not get there, whether it's climate, whether it's social justice, whether it's political justice, whatever it is, we must not get to a point of radicalism. That is an ideal principle. Sometimes I deviate from that, but nonetheless, I still believe in it. Desperate times calls for desperate measures. The third thing, green capitalism. The business as usual scenario. If we continue doing the things that we do today, where would the world be? If we decide to go green, where would the world be? So people say that green technologies are disruptive. They take the focus away from what it is we know. There's a new field that we need to charter and all those things. And so we shouldn't go there. And the thing is this, change is a constant. It is the law of life. Those who fixate themselves on the past and the present are most certainly going to miss the future. And so we need to think about the future. We need to dream about the future. The next thing is how capital intensive it is. So it's expensive, true. But if you look at it from the triple bottom line approach, it is not all expensive. Look at it from the perspective of this endeavor is going to increase social cohesion, it's going to protect the environment. It's not just going to take money out of my pocket anyway. So yes. And the thing is this, you can visualize it simply this way. When you look at it this way, for example, green tech, in going green, you are going to lose money, or it's expensive because if you look at the economics pathway, you're going to lose money in doing that. However, the money that you are going to save in not going green, if you keep destroying the environment and you do not go green, the money that you're going to save from not going green is going to be hard to use to repair that environment. So really, the accounts will say, okay, now by to what end, literally, or to what end? You're going to save money by not going green. The money that you save by not going green, you have to go and use to repair the environment that you destroyed by virtue of you not going green. So, which is it? Let's go green, protect the environment, still keep some money, and then we're okay with it. That is also an ideal, because I personally think that you cannot have the two of them. You cannot make money and protect the environment. It doesn't happen. It will not happen. So yes, we lose money through research and development, which is R&D, governmental and global policy regulations that don't favor the green transition, etc. So these are green technology challenges. Can we have so this response is symbolic because of our actions as human beings to destroy the environment. So yeah, Can we avert the crisis? The response is yes, we can. We can avert the crisis. So if we all decide to say, oh, let's stop polluting, we can avert the crisis. If we shut down factories for 2 months, we can do something. And COVID was an indicator that shows that we can do something about the crisis. And so for the crisis, we can do something about it. That's the first question. The next question, will we avert the crisis? Maybe we will. Maybe we will, because we're looking at the policies or what COP21 has set out to do and the things that has been done in the past. There is a roadmap that we can follow. There's a sorry guys. There's a blueprint that we can follow in order to make that happen. The question is, are we willing to do it? Is the political will there to do it? States like the US and China, will they stop polluting so that we can be able to do the things we want to do? That's the question that will help us know or will maintain at maybe. In the 20 years plus that climate change has been a subject of serious international negotiations, we have seen a trend of broadening participation in those deliberations. But for the most part, continues to be led by environment departments and constituencies. These conferences, often choked with several setbacks, as some parties pull out of agreement at the last minute, will continue to challenge achieving mitigation goals. And so while we're on the path, there are several setbacks that we face. That is why my response to that question, from both a personal, philosophical and scientific point of view, is maybe we will avert the crisis, maybe we will not. To conclude, the climate crisis requires us to do better. Each one of us, me, you, everybody out there, do better. Do not shower for more than 30 minutes. You don't need more than 30 minutes of water to take a clean bath. Put off your electrical appliances when they are not in use. If you can carpool, do so. Do not drive out alone. Find people who are going in your direction and drive a car with them, and make sure that you use public transport a lot. There are many things that we can do, but today's conversation is not one that is going to say, oh, save the climate. This is about giving you information that you can weaponize debates. And so these are the various ideas in debates. The one thing that you may think is missing from this presentation is what the big guys have done, but it's not missing, it's in there. The big guys have proposed a couple of things. One, they're going to give money in the Green Climate Fund, 100 million annually. That money is not coming, but yes, it is their proposal to do so. They're going to transfer technology to least developed countries and emerging economies to be able to adapt and all those things. Those are some of the things that the big guys have said they will do. Will they do it? That's a question for another day. And so thank you very much, guys. I'm sure you guys, well, I'm not sure, but I hope the session was as enlightening as I could have made it out to be. And so here we are at the end of the presentation. Thank you very much for your time. I think I'll take questions now. Okay, let me see participants. So, all right. Abimbola, please go ahead. Everybody must massacre the name. I think I'm good with names, so I didn't massacre it. So, Abimbola, please go ahead with your question. I'm listening.
All right. So, I just wanted to ask, the harms that this climate change has already caused, are they like correctable? Like, is it possible to correct them? Like, okay.
Go ahead. End your question.
Okay, like for instance, like in the North Pole, like the melting of several ice caps that have caused several like animals and organisms that are there to either die or have to migrate from that area, and all the other harms like the heat waves and all those things. The effect those things have caused, is it possible to overturn them if like we get greener?
Okay, I think this question is not, I cannot have a direct response for this. What I have is try to compartmentalize the effects. So let's start with the example that you gave. With the example that you gave, yes, we can rectify that. So we can rectify that by going back to temperatures of pre-industrial areas. So science shows us how ice is formed, right? Ice is formed when the temperature is low. At the ice caps, the temperature is lower there, and so there may be formation of ice caps again, but it will take a very slow process. That's the thing with climate change. So with climate change, the problems that occur very rapidly, if you want to reverse them, it takes a very slow process in reversing them. That is why many scientists and people like myself believe that the best form of adaptation is mitigation. So let us prevent the problem instead of creating the problem and saying, let's go and solve it. Let's just prevent it totally. And so some problems can be reversed, some cannot be reversed. So we're doing land reclamation in many places. We're doing vegetative reclamation. We are planting trees. We are getting back land that has been taken by the sea. We are constructing sea defense walls and all those things, all those many things. We are doing all those things. However, for animals that live in places like the ice caps or like places like North Pole that are now an endangered species, if they go extinct, we cannot give birth to those animals again. They are done. They're finished. And so things like that, and effects like that cannot be had again, right? Ocean temperatures rising, we can sort of go back to it. But the problem is that when ocean temperatures rise, there's also acidification of the ocean that cannot be reversed as easily as it should be. So even with the ice caps, even though we can have the ice forming again at a very slow rate, the problem with that is that the animals that are extinct due to that cannot come back. With ocean acidification, the same thing. With land reclamation, the same thing. Once the land is gone, we can get parts of the land back, but we cannot get all of it back. So some of it can be reversed, some cannot be reversed. For the ones that can be reversed, it usually takes a very slow process. But for afforestation and reforestation, those ones are sort of easier to deal with. And one thing that Abimbola, I hope your question is answered. Is your question responded to? Please, if not, you can type the clarification that you need in the chat box, and then I'll go back. But one thing that I want to speak about again is under the NDCs or under the Paris. Okay, great. Abimbola, question is responded to. The Paris Accord. We spoke about mitigation and then we spoke about adaptation. There are certain things. So with the definition of adaptation, we're living with the effects. With mitigation, we're trying to prevent the thing from happening. But there are certain activities that you can do as a mitigation effort that will yield adaptation results. So they are usually called co-benefits. So a mitigation effort that has adaptation synergy. So when you set out, the idea was to do mitigation, but in mitigating or in reducing the emission, you've got an adaptation result. Even though you got the mitigation results, you also got adaptation. Or there are some activities that you go around trying to adapt. You're just adapting. But in adapting, you see that you're also mitigating. So one very common example is when you go to the middle belt of Ghana, the middle belt. Sorry, I said that. Wow. The middle belt of Ghana. Also, Andrew, please, when I can see that you are recording, please edit this before you send it out, okay? That part, you have to take it out. When you go to the middle belt of Ghana, Techiman, that side, Techiman, those areas, not precisely Sunyani, but around those areas, those places used to be forests, and cocoa used to thrive within forest regions. But because there's a lot of deforestation going on, cocoa is not being able to thrive as much. And so what's happening is that many of the cocoa trees are dying. Farmers are losing out their money. So farmers realize that cashew. Cashew is becoming a very, very good commodity. A lot of people are venturing into cashew production and all that. So what they thought of was that, okay, cocoa is dying. It's a problem. It's an effect of climate change, deforestation. So climate change, right? If that is happening, what it means is that we need to find new ways of staying with the problem, right? So we need to adapt. So what they've done is that they've cut down their cocoa trees, or they've replaced their cocoa trees with cashew trees. So that's an adaptation effort. They are trying to live with the effects of climate change. In planting cashew trees, what they've done is they've got mitigation synergy, because now you are planting trees to replace the forests that were there and to replace your tree that you cut down already. And so that's a mitigation effort, because now these trees are now sequestering carbon. They are now absorbing carbon from the atmosphere. So the farmers set out to do adaptation, but in doing adaptation, they've got mitigation results as well as the adaptation. So they are getting cashew, they're selling, they're making their money anyway, but they're also reducing carbon in the atmosphere. That is an adaptation effort and has mitigation synergy. When you turn the same thing around, many governments, especially in Ghana, I know Ghana has participated in it, Nigeria has participated in it, some other West Africa has participated in it. The Red Plus program, which is an effort by the EU to sponsor emerging economies to plant more trees as mitigation efforts. So they are saying we should plant more trees, right? So we can go ahead and plant a lot of trees. We can plant acacia trees, we can plant neem tree, we can plant a lot of other ornamental trees and all those things. But then some states thought it wise that if we're going to plant these trees anyway, it's a mitigation effort, right? In mitigating, in planting trees to absorb carbon out of the atmosphere, why don't we plant trees that can bring us fruits so that we can eat those fruits as well, right? And so they decided to plant trees. So they went ahead and planted coconut trees, mango trees, they planted palm nut trees, and all those trees that now are an adaptation, a mitigation effort, take out carbon, but have now given us adaptation synergies. They're giving us food to be able to cope with the possibility of drought and food shortage and all those things. So in the reverse, that has happened. So that is an example of a mitigation effort that has adaptation synergy. The problem with this one is that because you set out to do a mitigation effort and not an adaptation effort, many times when these trees bear fruits, you don't find people to harvest them. And that is also a problem, because when fruits are ripe, they rot, they produce carbon. So while the idea was we want to sequester carbon, take away carbon from the atmosphere, what you have done in effect is to take away carbon from the atmosphere, create new carbon without a way of harvesting that carbon and putting it to good use. And so the cycle sort of continues and you have more carbon in the atmosphere. That is the problem with having a mitigation effort that has an adaptation synergy. However, there's very little problem with having an adaptation synergy that has mitigation efforts. So I acknowledge a question from Joseph. So Joseph says that, please, do you think with the concept of economic rationality in mind, we'll be able to mitigate climate change? First response, yes. I think countries and states will think about their well-being over good environmental conditions with economic rationality in mind. That is true. So yes, two opposing ideas can be true at the same time. Right? So yes, I think economic rationality in mind will be able to mitigate climate change. We can do it, just not as rapidly and as radical as we want it to be, but we can do it. Of course, states will think about their economic well-being, but like I said, we are now moving people to think about things from a triple bottom line approach. So if they are thinking about economic well-being, but they're also thinking about environmental well-being, and they're thinking about social well-being, they will somewhat be nudged towards the idea of climate action, which is good for us all. And so if we look at developments from a triple bottom approach thing, even keeping economic rationality in mind, we can still do it. Because economic rationality is more like we cannot do thing. We cannot shut down all our companies in the name of climate change. It does not necessarily mean that we cannot venture into green tech to augment what we have in how do you call it? In brown tech. And so while we are still driving fossil fuel powered cars, we can also explore the idea of green cars, electric cars, and all those things. You get. And so that is it. And with electric cars, you can find renewable energy ways like nuclear and all those things to power those cars and those industries. And that is one thing. And so I also recognize a message from Grace that says that, oh, thank you so much for the session. I have to drop off now. Oh, you're very welcome. You're very, very much welcome. And I'm glad I was here. So I've dealt with the question. Oh, you're welcome, Joseph. And welcome, Joseph. So if there are any other questions, I'll give 2 minutes for people to raise their hands and ask those said questions, or you can type the question in the chat box so that I can address them and then we can quickly end the session.
All right. Is it that there are no more questions? Okay, Gigi, there's a question for you in the chat space.
Okay, let me check that out. Okay, so Dolores says that I should shed more light on. Okay, no, that's not the first message. The first message was thank you. Okay, you're welcome, Dominic. The next one was environmental racism. Please shed more light on that. So, Dolores, if it's not a bother, I'd like to ask which country you are from. Okay, you're from Cameroon. My research has not taken me into Cameroon yet, and so there's very little perspective that I can grant you in that regard. But usually the idea of environmental racism is that environmental racism or injustice broadly, environmental injustice broadly is that many times we treat the environment around places where there are people that have low economic viability poorer than we treat a place that have people of higher economic viability. So for example, you are more likely to, and Dolores, I mean you, not me, you. You are more likely to, as it were, indiscriminately dump refuse on a high street or in an estate. Yes, let me put it this way, in an estate that is properly planned with good housing than you are to you are less likely to do that. You are less likely to dump refuse improperly or indiscriminately in a properly planned estate than you are to dump refuse in a slum. The reason is this: many times people who inhabit places around estates are economically viable than people who dwell in slums. And so because it's a slum, they don't have capital to be able to speak up against the injustice that's being done to them. And so you go ahead and do it anyway. But because it is an estate and the people have money, they can, as it were, take you on legally in court, or they can cause your arrest or do something to you. You are less likely to do that. And that is why many times waste disposal services or waste management services would pick rubbish from estates, collect refuse from estates, collect waste from estates, and dump them in some village somewhere where nobody is looking, because those people do not have money. So it's easy for them to even pay them off or pay the residents there and dump the refuse there. The idea behind this is they don't have one, economic resource, two, social capital, which many instances translates to political capital to be able to take perpetrators of this harm on. So because the money is not there, it takes away a lot of things. And so while people like to say that education is the greatest equalizer, I always like to say money is the greatest equalizer. If you have money, that is it. Many people are educated, but they've not been equalized yet. So yeah, that's it. So it is hinged on the idea that when you're poor, your environment is treated poorly than when you are rich. It's as simple as that. Dolores, is that light enough for you? Or I need to go a step further? Okay, Dolores, you're welcome. And so one thing I'd like to say, my time has been exhausted. Strangely, I've exhausted my time. I thought I was going to do this within 30 minutes and then leave here, but it's always good to speak to debaters. And so, yeah, that's it. So one thing I like to say is that if I realize that most of you are students because I've had conversations with TCO organizers and all that. Well, many times that's what we start off as doing DP debate and all that, and that's how come we meet each other. And so, with these things, yeah, that is it. You need to take studies seriously. I'm not going to give you pep talk like our parents. I'm just giving you a perspective from which I'm coming. That many times school is good. It's